They never looked at her twice. Just a quiet maid in a plain uniform, moving silently through the marble hall. Some guests even whispered, smirking. She probably can't read the menu, let alone a riddle. But when the sheikh placed a carved puzzle box on the table, daring everyone to solve it, and no one at the banquet could even open it, the same maid they ignored stepped forward. And what happened next silenced the entire room. Before we go further, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it where you are right now? I'd love to see how far this story is traveling tonight. The marble hall glowed under chandeliers, every crystal prism scattering gold across the polished floor. It was the kind of evening where every laugh echoed a little too loud, where every whisper sounded sharper than the silver cutlery lining the table. At the far end of the hall sat the sheikh, majestic in a deep ivory robe with gold trim, his keffiyeh folded with royal precision, a black aggle holding it in place. He leaned back in his carved chair, the centerpiece of the table and the reason for the night's gathering. Guests filled the room, businessmen, scholars, foreign dignitaries, all dressed in tailored suits and flowing dishdashas. The air was thick with the smell of saffron rice, slow-roasted lamb, and the faintest trace of oud from the sheikh's own robe. Moving quietly among them was the maid. She wore a simple black uniform, her hair pinned under a white scarf, hands gloved in cotton as she refilled glasses and cleared plates. Her hazel eyes rarely lifted from the floor. She had learned long ago that lingering glances drew unnecessary attention. But even silence could be mocked. "She walks like a shadow," one guest chuckled under his breath, leaning toward his companion. The other smirked. "A shadow with no name. I wonder if she even understands have to." He word spoken in this hall. Their laughter was soft but sharp enough for her to hear. She kept her hands steady, her face calm, though a single muscle in her jaw tightened. She had served here for years, knew every tile in the floor, every crease in the carpet. She knew which guests tipped generously and which ones left crumbs of arrogance on their plates. She knew which servants whispered kindly in the kitchen and which ones mocked her silence too. Tonight was different. Tonight, the sheikh had called for a puzzle. It arrived in a velvet-lined box carried by an attendant with careful hands. The sheikh himself placed it at the center of the table, a carved wooden cube, each side etched with strange geometric patterns, brass pins glinting in the candlelight. Murmurs rippled down the table. "A riddle box," someone said, curiosity piqued. "Yes," the sheikh's voice rolled like distant thunder, deep and measured. "Inside this box is something of value. A key, not to gold, but to a decision I must make tonight. Whoever opens it will have the right to speak first on the matter that follows." The guests exchanged eager glances. It was not every night that the sheikh invited challenge. One by one they reached for the box, turning it in their hands, pressing at the brass pins, twisting at the seams. A merchant with jeweled rings tried first, pulling and pushing with confidence. Nothing. A scholar next, stroking his beard, muttering to himself as he searched for a pattern. Nothing. Even a foreign diplomat took a turn, grinning as though sure his cleverness would win the night. Nothing. The box sat stubborn, silent, unmoved. Frustration spread like a shadow. "It may be unsolvable," someone said. "Perhaps the sheikh only meant to entertain us," another added. Laughter returned to the hall, dry, brittle laughter meant to cover unease. Through it all, the maid continued at her work, refilling goblets, clearing plates, her hazel eyes flicking toward the box each time she passed the table. And then one of the guests, emboldened by wine, leaned back and said loud enough for half the hall to hear, "Perhaps we should ask the maid. It looks simple enough for her." Laughter erupted, cruel and careless. The maid's hand froze for a heartbeat above the goblet she was filling. The sheikh raised a single brow, but did not speak. He simply looked at her, just a glance, but enough for the room to follow his gaze. And suddenly, every eye was on her. She felt their stares like heat against her skin, felt the weight of their mockery pressing her down. For a moment she thought of stepping back, of vanishing into the kitchen where no one would see her. But the box sat there, stubborn and waiting. She set the goblet down carefully, wiped her gloved hands on her apron, and took a single step forward. The laughter dimmed. She walked toward the table, her steps silent on the marble floor. The sheikh's eyes followed her, unreadable. When she reached the center, she stopped. Her hazel eyes lifted for the first time that night, meeting the gaze of the man who had mocked her. His smirk faltered. She placed both hands on the table. "If no one else can solve it," she said softly, her voice carrying despite its calm, "then let me try." The hall went silent. The sheikh leaned forward, interest flickering across his face for the first time. "Very well," he said, gesturing toward the box. "Show us." The hall held its breath. Even the sound of the fountain outside seemed to fade as the maid reached for the puzzle box. Her gloved fingers brushed the carved wood, tracing the geometric patterns as if greeting something familiar. It was warm from all the hands that had tried and failed, its brass pins shining under the chandelier. A guest coughed deliberately, breaking the silence. "Careful," he said, his tone mocking. "Wouldn't want you to break it. It might cost more than a year if your wages." Laughter rippled softly around the table. The maid ignored it. She turned the cube slowly, noting every side, every tiny groove cut into the surface. Her brow furrowed just slightly. She was not rushing, not forcing anything. Another voice called out from the end of the table, half amused, half cruel. "She will pray over it, perhaps. That's her solution." More laughter. The sheikh said nothing. His chin rested on his hand, his dark eyes fixed on her, as though she were the only person in the room worth watching. She pressed gently on one of the brass pins. It clicked faintly, though the box did not open. The sound silenced half the room for a moment. "Was that supposed to happen?" a foreign diplomat asked. "She got lucky," the merchant with the jeweled rings scoffed. "The real sequence will stop her soon enough." But she didn't look discouraged. She rotated the box, found the matching pattern on the opposite face, and pressed again. Another faint click. The murmurs grew louder now, not quite laughter, not quite admiration. "She's guessing," someone muttered. "No," another corrected under his breath, unease in his tone. "She knows what she's doing." The maid adjusted her grip, turning the box toward the light. Her eyes followed the grain of the wood, noting where lines intersected, where one panel was just slightly off-center. She remembered evenings in the servants' quarters, long after work was done, when she sat with her father's old wooden puzzles. He had taught her that every box had a language, that every lock told a story if you were patient enough to listen. She smiled faintly, just for herself, not for the room, then slid her thumb across one of the grooves. Another piece clicked into place. This time, the hall fell completely silent. Even the man who had mocked her first leaned forward slightly, his smirk slipping. "Enough of this," a younger guest protested, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. "It's embarrassing. Let one of us try again." But the sheikh raised a hand, silencing him. His voice was calm, but carried across the hall. "Let her continue." The younger guest's mouth snapped shut. The maid turned the cube again, fingers finding the last movable panel. But she didn't press it yet. She paused, feeling the weight of every eye on her. Her breath was steady. Her hazel eyes lifted once more, meeting the sheikh's gaze. And for a moment, the entire hall seemed to vanish, leaving just the two of them, the ruler who had set the challenge, and the servant who dared to answer it. She placed her thumb against the final brass pin and stopped. Her hand hovered there as the hall held its breath. "Why did she stop?" someone whispered. "Because she doesn't know the last step," the merchant sneered, eager for her failure. But her eyes never left the sheikh. She was waiting for something unseen, unheard. And in that suspended moment, with the last piece one press away from release, the sheikh's lips curved into the faintest smile. The final pin gleamed under the chandelier, small as a seed and twice as stubborn. Her thumb hovered above it. The hall waited the way water waits for a dropped stone. Someone couldn't bear the silence. "Press it," the merchant with the jeweled rings called too loudly. "Or step aside and let a real mind finish what you started." A few thin laughs answered him, the kind people offer to reassure themselves they still matter. The sound slid across the marble and died there. She didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on the box, then, slowly, lifted them to the sheikh. His gaze had not moved. It held her as a lantern holds a flame, bright enough to see by, gentle enough not to scorch. "Why did you stop?" His voice was low, unhurried. She weighed her words the way she had weighed the box. "Because this last step isn't on the surface, Highness." "Meaning?" A scholar leaned forward, already preparing to disagree. "Meaning the box isn't only wood and pins," she said softly. "It is also intention. Some locks answer to force, some answer to sequence, and some answer to respect." More laughter, brittle this time. "Respect?" The diplomat grinned at the nearest guests. "Shall we sing it a poem?" The sheikh didn't smile. He simply tipped his chin, inviting her to continue. She turned the cube in her hands and breathed on the brass pin. A fog softened the metal, then vanished. "This is not new brass," she murmured more to herself than to the room. "It has been touched many times. There is oil in the groove. Heat loosens it." "Oh, she intends to warm it with prayer," the younger guest said, relieved to have found a joke to throw. Her gloved fingers remained steady. "Not with prayer," she answered, calm. "With patience." She laid the cube flat and ran one fingertip along a hairline seam almost lost in the pattern. The seam curved, not straight like a carpenter's cut, but bending to echo a tiny star etched into the corner. She followed that arc with her eyes and then with her breath. "My father had puzzles," she said without looking up. "He taught me that every maker leaves himself inside his work. A habit, a devotion, a way the hand moves without being told." "And you suppose you have found this maker's devotions?" the scholar asked, the word suppose sharpened to wound. She glanced at the top face, the one etched with a rosette that looked, now that she saw it, almost like the seal pressed on the sheikh's invitations. The geometry rhymed with the emblem on the banner that hung behind his chair. A star nested inside a star, one arm slightly longer than the rest. Unbalanced, if you weren't looking. Perfect, if you knew why. She looked up at the sheikh. "May I bring it nearer to you?" That stirred the room. The merchant scoffed. The diplomat sat a pea straighter, curious despite himself. The manager at the far wall, who had been pretending not to exist, stiffened. The sheikh lifted his hand, and the objections died before they reached their teeth. "You may." She stepped closer to the head of the table. It wasn't a long distance, but the air changed there, the way it does on the threshold of a room you don't enter unless invited. She set the box gently on the table before him and turned it so that the slightly longer arm of the star faced his chair. "Ah," the scholar said, unable to help himself. "Symbol games. Align the pretty lines and call it wisdom." She didn't answer. Instead, she bowed her head, not a deep bow, Not theater, just the tilt of a person acknowledging another's place. Then she took the cube back into her hands and, with careful fingers, rotated the side panel she had refused to touch before. It did not budge. A relieved murmur flared at the table's end. As we said, she exhaled once, long and even. The box is listening, she said, almost to the brass. It will not answer to a command given in a room that mocks. That is enough, the merchant snapped, annoyed that his laughter had been called by its true name. We are not the lock. No, she agreed, and finally looked at him. You are the noise. The sentence wasn't cruel. It landed like a mirror instead of a blade. Several faces flinched as if they'd seen themselves and disliked the view. The Sheikh's eyes warmed, a sunrise hidden behind stone. What do you require, then? Silence, she said. And your permission. My permission I granted, he replied. As for silence... His hand lifted, and with that one movement, the hall remembered it had a ruler. The low whispers that had been crawling along the table legs scurried away. Even the musicians at the far wall let their strings rest. The quiet that followed was not emptiness. It was attention. She closed her eyes and pressed her thumb against the final pin, not to force it, but to feel its temper, a chore. Warm now from her touch. She waited, the way one waits for bread to rise or for a child to finish a story. Not impatient, not idle, simply present. A beat, then another. Somewhere in the courtyard a fountain kept its vow. Listen, she whispered. To what? The scholar asked, but softer. To the spring. She smiled a little. Everything that holds wants, someday, to let go. A long heartbeat later, the faintest sound answered, so faint that half the room missed it, and the other half doubted they hadn't imagined it. A sigh, not of wood, not of metal, but of something old, deciding it had been seen. She opened her eyes. The pin had loosened into the smallest possible movement, not enough to slide, but enough to admit that sliding was possible. Her gloved thumb eased it, not down, as every hand before had tried, but sideways, along the curve of the hidden seam. The pin yielded the width of a grain of rice. The box did not open. Two panels that had seemed flush now kissed with the tiniest shadow between them. A current ran through the hall. This was no longer parlor sport. This was a conversation with a thing that had something to say. Coincidence, the diplomat whispered, but he did not sound convinced. She took a slow breath. There is one more piece, she said. Of course there is, the merchant muttered. There always is with theatrics. She ignored him. Her eyes had fixed on a tiny brass stud she hadn't touched yet. Not a pin like the others, but an inlay, engraved with a pattern so fine it looked like a scratch until the light caught it. I thought this was ornament, she said. It is not. The sheikh leaned forward, his hands open on the table, offering attention the way some men offer coins. It is a memory, she continued, a maker's habit. She looked up, and for the first time a true smile touched her mouth. He leaves a mark where he hid the hinge. She slid the pad of her finger across the stud and felt, not a click, but a breath of movement beneath, as if a tiny door had stretched its joints after a long sleep. Something inside the box shifted. The room heard it. The sound was not loud and not long. It was simply undeniable. The cube had exhaled. A hush fell so complete the air seemed to thicken. Even the people who wanted to be angry at the maid could not find their anger in that sound. It had gone somewhere quieter. The scholar swallowed. What remains? She did not answer him. She looked at the sheikh again, and this time her voice was barely a string of air. There is a word. A word? the diplomat scoffed, reaching for arrogance and finding it had moved. We hired a locksmith and received a poet. She inclined her head. You hired laughter and received listening. The sheikh's gaze did not waver. What word? She let the box rest against her palm and did not look away from him as she spoke. The word you say before you take what is not yours. The word you say before you open what does not belong to you. The word that admits breath is borrowed. Several guests bowed their heads without meaning to. The merchant stared at his rings and saw nothing worth counting. The sheikh's mouth curved, not amusement, recognition. He placed his right hand over his heart, a gesture older than the box, older than the hall. His lips shaped the word so softly only those closest could hear it. Perhaps he said it only inside his chest, where words go when they are true enough not to need air. She lowered her gaze to the cube. The last pin stood ready now, loose with warmth, aligned with the mark the maker had left for anyone patient enough to find it. She placed her thumb upon it, not to press, but to promise. The hall leaned forward as one body. She did not push. Not yet. Because a footstep sounded at the far end of the marble, firm and out of place in a room that had agreed to be quiet. A latecomer, broad-shouldered, expensive, cut the silence in half as easily as a sail cuts weti. Ate her. He strode toward the table with the carelessness of a man who had never been told no. Apologies, he announced, not apologizing at all. I was detained. Dozens of eyes swung from the maid to the intruder. Only two did not move, hers and the sheikh's. The newcomer took in the scene, the box in her hands, the sheikh's attention fixed, the room's breath held, and smiled the smile of a man who believes there is no door he cannot walk through. Ah, he said, and reached for the cube. Her hands did not leave it, neither did her eyes. Highness, he added with a bow that bent just enough to be rude, shall I finish this game for you? The sheikh did not answer him. The box did. Inside its small, deliberate body, something settled into the exact place it had been waiting to find. And under her thumb, the last pin finally agreed to move. The last pin waited under her thumb, loose and ready, but she did not move. The hall seemed to lean closer, as if the walls themselves wished to see. The latecomer stepped nearer, his shoes loud on the marble. He was a man carved from confidence, broad chest, expensive cufflinks, beard trimmed to perfection. His scent of oud reached them before his shadow did. He extended his hand casually. Give it here, he said, as though asking for salt at the table. No one spoke, but the silence was not empty. It was lined with tension, with a question everyone was too afraid to ask. Would the maid obey? Her hazel eyes lifted, calm, steady, almost curious. Why? The man blinked. Because you are wasting everyone's time. These games are meant for those who understand them. Games, she repeated softly. You think this is a game? He laughed once, short and sharp. Of course it is. We eat, we drink, we solve a puzzle to amuse the sheikh, and we go home. Do you imagine it decides anything of weight? The sheikh's voice, when it came, as quiet but cut through the room like a blade. It decides everything of weight. Tonight it decides who speaks first, and therefore who is heard. The latecomer's smile faltered, but only for a second. He bowed his head slightly, mocking respect. Then surely a servant's voice is not the one you wish to hear. A ripple ran through the hall, half agreement, half discomfort. Some nodded, others glanced at the sheikh nervously as if hoping he would stop this. The maid's thumb still rested on the pin. She did not answer him directly. Instead, she looked back at the box. When a maker hides a hinge, he hides himself, she said, her voice level. And when you find him, you must decide whether to honor his work or rush it. Her gloved hand adjusted slightly, pressing just enough to let the pin click one step further. The sound echoed like a small drum beat. A panel shifted visibly this time, opening a hair's breadth. Gasps broke across the table. "She's nearly done," someone whispered. The latecomer frowned, stepping even closer. "This is absurd. You give the hall's dignity to a servant?" "She took it," the scholar murmured, half in awe, half in fear. The man reached forward again, faster this time, as though he might simply take the box from her hands. But before his fingers could touch it, the sheikh's hand came down flat on the table. The sound was soft, but it cracked through the room like lightning. "You were late," the sheikh said evenly. "You forfeited your right to speak until she is finished." The latecomer froze, then drew his hand back slowly. The hall exhaled in one long, quiet breath. The maid bowed her head slightly, not in triumph, but in thanks. Her fingers traced the edge of the panel that had just loosened. She knew now where the final turn would come, but she did not rush. Instead, she placed the cube gently back on the table, not yet opening it, her hands folded in front of her. "You stop again?" the diplomat asked, incredulous. "Yes," she said. "Why now?" "Because the room is not read." "Duh," she answered simply. And somehow no one laughed this time. The sheikh studied her for a long moment, then leaned back slowly, signaling for fresh tea. "Let the room learn readiness," he said. And the cube remained closed, sitting on the table like a beating heart, waiting for the moment it would finally open. The cube rested on the polished table like a living thing, its seams loosened but not yet parted. The chandelier light traced every brass pin, every line of grain, until it looked less like wood and more like a map, waiting for someone who knew how to read it. The maid kept her hands folded in front of her, her posture calm, almost humble. Yet the calmness was heavier than any laughter the room had once offered. It demanded patience. Not everyone could bear it. The latecomer shifted in his chair, annoyance curdling into open disdain. "This farce has gone on long enough. She is playing with us, pretending at wisdom, when the answer is surely mechanical." "Then why could you not solve it?" the scholar muttered under his breath. His eyes, sharp with curiosity now, were locked on the box. The merchant with jeweled rings scoffed, leaning forward. "If this servant opens it, it will be nothing more than luck. A stumble in the right direction." "Then let her stumble again," the sheikh said, his tone flat. That silenced them all. The maid lifted her eyes, hazel steady, and reached once more for the cube. Her fingers traced its edges slowly, reverently, as if each line of wood had a story to tell. She pressed lightly against the loosened panel. It slid a fraction more, sighing like a door that had been kept shut for years. A ripple of sound spread across the table. Someone gasped. Someone else muttered a prayer. Even those who had mocked her earlier leaned closer, eyes wide. The diplomat licked his lips nervously. It moved again." "Yes," the maid said, softly. "It will move until it is ready to open fully." The merchant shook his head, frustrated. "Objects are not ready. They are forced. You push, they yield." She turned her gaze to him at last, calm but cutting. "And when you push a door not meant for you, it breaks. What enters then is not knowledge. It is ruin." The man said nothing more. She rotated the cube carefully, her gloves squeaking faintly against the polished wood. Her eyes narrowed at a faint groove along the top panel, invisible to most in the hall. She slid her finger across it. Another small shift answered her. This time the box seemed to breathe again, an audible creak, a whisper from its joints. The hall stilled. "She's doing it," the scholar whispered, wonder overtaking skepticism. The latecomer leaned forward, impatience cracking his voice. "Then finish it." But she didn't. She set the box back on the table gently, almost lovingly, and straightened. "Why do you stop again?" the diplomat demanded, half frantic. Her answer was simple. "Because the last step is not for me." Murmurs spread, sharp and restless. Not for her? What does she mean? She's afraid. But the sheikh did not move. His eyes remained on her, steady and unreadable. "Explain," he said at last. She folded her hands behind her back, her voice carrying clearly now. "The box was made for a ruler, not for a servant. It will open only when the one it belongs to acknowledges it." The hall erupted. "Absurd!" the merchant shouted. "Convenient," sneered the latecomer. But the sheikh raised his hand, silencing them with a single gesture. "And how would you know this?" She met his gaze. "Because every hinge I have opened tonight was not just wood or brass. It was story. And this story is not mine to finish. It is yours." The silence that followed was thicker than stone. Guests looked between her and the sheikh, uncertain, unsettled. The idea that a maid could hold authority over when the ruler acted was almost unthinkable. Almost. The sheikh leaned forward, resting both hands on the table. His eyes flicked once to the box, then back to her. "And if I refuse?" "Then it will remain closed," she said simply. The words rang like a bell, certain, unafraid. For the first time that night, the sheikh's lips curved into a true smile, not mocking, not faint, but alive. He placed his hand over the cube. "Then let us see if the box agrees with you." The hall leaned closer, eyes wide, breaths caught. The sheikh pressed where she had shown him. The final pin slid, smooth as water. The cube shuddered once, then stilled. The guests gasped, some rising halfway from their seats. The scholar's eyes gleamed. The diplomat's mouth fell open. Even the merchant who had mocked her stared in disbelief. The maid's expression didn't change. She only lowered her gaze, as though bowing not to the sheikh, but to the truth she had spoken. The box was ready, but it had not yet revealed its secret. The sheikh's hand paused atop it, waiting. And the hall, once loud with laughter, now drowned in silence, waiting with him. The sheikh's hand rested on the cube like a seal about to be pressed into wax. The hall leaned forward as one body, breaths shallow, hearts racing. He turned the panel gently, the last hidden seam sliding free. A soft click echoed, clear, final, almost ceremonial. The box opened. Inside lay a single key carved from bone-white ivory, resting on a cushion of red velvet. Alongside it, a folded parchment sealed with wax. A murmur spread through the guests. "A key? What does it open?" The sheikh lifted the parchment, broke the seal, and read in silence for a long moment. When he looked up, there was something sharper, prouder in his eyes. "This," he said, holding up the key, "is the key to the North Archives. And this letter states that the first voice to unlock the box must decide which petition will be heard tonight." The hall went still. The petitions had been the very reason for this gathering. Business disputes, land grants, pleas from merchants and nobles alike. Everyone had come expecting to be heard. Now the decision belonged to the maid. "She cannot," the merchant began, but his voice died when the sheikh's gaze fell on him. "She can," the sheikh said simply, "and she will." He gestured for the maid to step forward. Her hazel eyes widened, but she did not hesitate. She walked to the head of the table, every step sounding louder than the last. When she stood before him, the sheikh placed the key in her gloved hand. "Speak," he said. She looked down the length of the table at the gathered guests, the mocking faces now silent, the arrogant latecomer pale, the scholar watching with bright, humbled curiosity. Her voice was calm, clear. "Then let the petition of the workers be heard first, the ones whose wages are still unpaid." The words struck the hall like a struck drum. Some guests shifted uncomfortably, others bowed their heads, ashamed. The sheikh nodded slowly. "So it will be." And with that, the maid placed the key back on the table, bowing slightly. "I have spoken." The sheikh's lips curved into the faintest smile. "And you have been heard." As the petitions began, the maid quietly stepped back, melting into the shadow of the hall once more. But something had changed. The air around her no longer pressed her down. It parted for her, clearing a path. Even the merchant could not meet her eyes as she passed. When she reached the door, the sheikh's voice stopped her gently. "You may leave the hall tonight with your head unbowed. Tomorrow, there will be a new position for you, one that lets your voice speak more often." She turned, bowing once, gratitude shining in her eyes. "Thank you, Highness." And then she was gone, her steps silent, but her presence louder than the chandeliers above. They ignored her when she was silent. They mocked her when she dared to try. But when she spoke truth, even the hall had to listen. If this story moved you, if you believe in quiet courage and dignity that cannot be silenced, subscribe to Life and Death Decisions for more stories like this one.